And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I am Hardeep Matharu.
Tonight we join you in very sombre circumstances. After the death of Sir David Amess MP, after a violent knife attack, when he was meeting his constituents in his regular Friday meetings. Tributes have been paid across the political spectrum to Sir David. And soon, in a moment, we'll be talking to Tom Brake, former Liberal Democrat MP, who knew them. But before that, all of us at Byline Times and Byline TV would like to extend our heartfelt condolences to Sir David's family and all those who knew and loved him. Members of Parliament don't just represent their political parties. They represent all the constituents. An attack on them is an attack on democracy. So we're united in support for that belief and in our mourning for Sir David.
This week saw the publication of a report into the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic by two influential parliamentary committees. We'll be speaking to Dr. Deepti Gurusani, an epidemiologist and senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London, to digest the findings and the recommendations. We'll also be continuing to have our look at the problems being caused by Brexit, and we'll be speaking to Professor Catherine Barnard of Trinity College, Cambridge. And then a bit later on, Byline's Otto English will be joining us in the studio, and he'll also be around for our After Dark Q&A with myself and Peter.
And if you'd like to join us for that, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Byline TV and joining as a subscriber or joining us on our YouTube channel.
But first of all, we're very happy to be joined by former Liberal Democrat MP Tom Brake and also the founder of Unlock Democracy. Tom, thank you very much for being with us again tonight in very sad circumstances. Just ask you, first of all, what your memories were of Sir David Amess.
Tom, can you hear us? Go back to Tom Brake, MP, obviously sound issues there with our Zoom call. Nobody's perfect. We're going to be talking in a moment, if we get back to him, to Deepti Gurusani, from epidemiologist at Queen University, Mary University. But earlier this week, in fact, yesterday, I think it was Hardeep sat down with Greg Clark from the committee which made this report, parliamentary committee, two committees, into the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis. Their findings were quite shocking. They found that this government's handling of the coronavirus crisis, particularly in those early few months of late lockdown, was the worst public health disaster in British history. So Hardeep was joined by Greg and another MP, Dawn Butler, sitting on the committee, and our own Mike Galsworthy, who is obviously a scientist and a bit of an expert on many of these matters. We'll look at that clip now and hopefully get back to Tom Brake and then Deepti Gurusani, all technical things being well.
I want the government and the other public bodies to implement them immediately. And I'm concerned, I would be concerned if the government said, well, we'll wait for the public inquiry, or civil society said, well, we'll wait for the public inquiry. They've got it.
How can we make the 38?
How do we give any of this teeth?
Yeah, because we've spoken about this on other reports. I mean, people say, do you work with people in other parties? Yeah. Select committees are an example of working together very well, for the betterment of whatever the subject matter is. So how do we ensure that these 38 recommendations are taken seriously by the government?
Well, I think our work starts from now. First of all, the government have to respond to our report. That's one of the statutory requirements when there is a report like this. Because there's been so much public interest in our report, I'm sure there'll be a great deal of public interest in their response. And if it's an inadequate response, then I think there will be a price to pay for that. But that's that's one thing, but I'm sure you will, Dawn, as I will, and I hope anyone that has read our report will press for each one of those recommendations. We've got recommendations as to how people are treated in care homes. There's a big section we haven't talked much about the impact on minorities and some of the inequalities that are revealed by this. So in many different respects, we've got a campaigning platform, and I don't just want this to be sitting on the shelf as, as a kind of critical success. It should be a campaigning document that we want to see its recommendations put in place before the public inquiry.
Well, we'll be talking more about that. It's shocking and quite important parliamentary finding by two committees, led by two Conservative MPs. But I'm delighted now, we've now got Tom Brake back on the line, and he can hear us.
Yes, we're now joined by Tom Brake, who's the former Liberal Democrat MP and also the founder of Unlock Democracy. Tom, can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us again. Such sad circumstances. Just firstly, what are your memories of Sir David Amess?
Well, my memories are of someone who was a very, very active constituency MP who used every opportunity in Parliament to raise issues like the city status for Southend that he was campaigning for. I had to respond as a minister to a number of debates that he took part in, where he would enumerate 15, 16 or 20 different priority issues that he thought should be addressed in his constituency. So he was genuinely a very committed and hard-working constituency MP, and clearly he'll be sorely missed by members of Parliament and, of course, his family, for whom this is an absolutely horrible tragedy.
The Prime Minister tonight commended him for his kindness and also his gentle manner. I mean, is that something that you remembered? It seems that people from across the political spectrum are also noting those qualities in him.
Absolutely, and it's noticeable that members of Parliament will fall into different categories. There are those who are very aggressive in their style of questioning or debating, and David Amess definitely wasn't one of those. He was much more cordial, I think, in his attitude and his approach to ministers or to members of Parliament in opposing parties.
Tom, just from point of view of the public, who haven't been MPs in Parliament or like you, a minister, do these friendships often happen across the political divide? I mean, there's a Labour MP, former Labour MP, who describes how charming and how supportive he was, that Sir David Amess was, when she had a cancer diagnosis. Do you find that in a way, though the political allegiances are obviously quite clear cut, that actually on the personal level you can't tell who you're going to get on with or not?
Yes, that's very true, and often it is possible to set aside perhaps the debating that happens, the aggression, and often the fundamental conflicts that occur over key principles. But for instance, members of Parliament will often go on committee trips together. For instance, if they're on a select committee, might be going abroad, for instance, and there are opportunities there to forge relationships with members of other parties that will last. And clearly for many members of Parliament, that was the case with David Amess, also around the issues such as animal welfare, on which he was a well-known campaigner, where he would have made contact with MPs from other parties and established a relationship that was not about parties, but was issues-based.
So there are many issues, aren't there, across the divide, where you'll find politicians from different parties agreeing, going on trips. Just on a more practical level, a political level, as you've been an MP, this weekly meeting that MPs have with their constituents, this is a kind of precious and fairly unusual element of British democracy, is it not?
It is, and certainly from talking to other politicians, other elected officials in other parliaments, some things that UK members of Parliament do, like holding constituency surgeries, like doing door-to-door canvassing, public meetings are often something that it doesn't happen in other countries. And they're quite surprised, for instance, at the idea that a member of parliament or a candidate would want to go door to door talking to people about their political affiliations. It's hard to see how this could stop. Now, clearly there will be I'm sure, a review of security arrangements at an appropriate time. But this issue of the accessibility of members of parliament is fundamental to the way our democracy works. People want to be able to see their member of parliament. Now, security measures were rightly enhanced after the tragic murder of Joe Cox, but there's a limit to what can be done. And certainly I would hope that we wouldn't arrive at a situation where the only way that anyone could ever contact their member of parliament was through Zoom.
I mean, following the very sad news today, Tom, there's people have been speaking out on social media, some serving MPs saying, you know, they're now questioning whether being an MP is still a role that they want. Are you surprised to hear people saying that actually it's just such a dangerous profession these days?
Well, I don't know whether it is more or less dangerous than other professions where people are working in the public sector, providing public services, whether it's ambulance drivers, social workers, doctors, or indeed the police. There are many professions who face the same sorts of risks. And I'm confident that people will want to stand for Parliament. They will be rightly more aware of the risks. There may be extra steps that can be taken, but a democracy can't work in a prison-style environment where people cannot access their elected representatives.
Now, we do not know the motives behind this attack, nor should we speculate at this stage. But on sort of a separate but maybe related issue, have you felt that there has been an increasing distrust of mainstream politicians? That, some people go back to the expenses scandal. In fact, last week we talked about it, 2010, this sense that politicians themselves were, more venal than they used to be or less trusted. Do you think there is a wider distrust of politics and politicians, which could not have anything to do with this attack, but has happened over the last few years, which would make people less likely to become MPs?
But there's no doubt that the expenses scandal did absolutely nothing for the reputation of members of parliament, and that included those who were involved, perhaps in taking advantage of the system, and indeed those who weren't. And that has stayed undoubtedly as a blot on parliamentarians. But the other element, which clearly didn't exist, for instance, when I was elected back in 1997, the other element is the way that social media can generate noise, can generate false news stories around things that have happened, can exaggerate things in a way that never applied before. And that certainly does, I'm afraid, I think, feed a tension within the system that members of parliament will find, at best off-putting, and at worst really threatening, and may well discourage some from wanting to stand.
And your project, Unlock Democracy, is this a part of what you're working on to sort of encourage participation and trust in politics again?
Yes, although thank you for describing me as the founder of Unlock Democracy. That is not true. Unlock Democracy, in fact, the predecessor organisation was Charter 88, which was founded in 1988. So
by Anthony Barnett,
Anthony Barnett. So I'm not the founder, but what we campaign on are issues like transparency and accountability, and I think those are fundamental things when it comes to restoring trust. One, if people cannot or do not believe that their politicians are being open and are not held to account for the things that they do, then that clearly does has an impact on trust. And that's where we as an organisation are focusing our attention.
Well, thank you so much for your insights into Sir David Amess tonight, Tom. And you know, so sad to meet you again in these circumstances, but we hope you'll join us again on Byline TV in the future.
Thank you.
So back to the coronavirus and what is described as this government, Boris Johnson's government, woeful handling of it by two select committees earlier this week, as we saw. We're now delighted to be joined again, once again, by Deepti Goswami, an epidemiologist and a regular contributor to Byline Times. Deepti, welcome. And what did you make of that bipartisan dual report by two committees about the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis last year?
I think the report is scathing. It makes very, very clear that there were huge failures on part of government. And, you know, the fact that it's a bipartisan report is important because, I mean, it's undeniable that huge failures occurred. But one thing that came across reading the report, and the report is titled Lessons Learned, was that we see the same failures being recapitulated now. So it's not something about the past where, you know, there's a report on the failures that happened, but they've been rectified. They haven't been rectified. And a lot of what was mentioned in the report, we see in the pandemic response now. The lack of transparency mentioned, it's still very evident. For example, we still don't have basic rationale for government policy on vaccination of children, on removal of masks in May this year. The fatalism that the report talks about, that, you know, government and its advisors were at that point in time convinced that if they took measures, there would be an inevitable second wave, so there was no point acting. We see that now in the implicit acceptance of about 800 deaths per week, which is equivalent to over 40,000 deaths a year, and in the implicit acceptance of the NHS being, well, constantly overwhelmed and having about 6 million people on waiting lists. And we see that in Chris Whitty's and everybody else's consistent comparisons to flu, which was highlighted as one of the major errors that SARS-CoV-2,
Sorry, Deepti. Well, one of the things that Byline Times was warning about from the beginning of the pandemic was this concept of a herd immunity by natural infection approach that a few of us in science, in medicine, and in the media, a few of us were very concerned about this notion that the virus should be allowed to spread so people can build up a degree of natural immunity. But of course, that involved spreading a highly contagious, a highly dangerous virus. The report said that actually the policy decisions made, the inevitable outcome of the way that Boris Johnson's government approached the pandemic meant that you got herd immunity, as you know, in effect anyway. I mean, were you surprised by that finding? Do you think there is, you know, the sort of the ghost of herd immunity is still lurking around? It's still, to some extent, defining the approach that's being taken forward?
No, it wasn't surprising at all. I mean, they said so. Patrick Vallance went on Sky News and essentially said that the aim was to get 60% of the population infected and immune to achieve herd immunity. And it's never been off the table. I mean, remember September when Sage warned that we needed a circuit breaker urgently, otherwise thousands of people would die. And our government met with Sunetra Gupta, Anders Tegnell, and Carl Hennigan, who were proponents of this herd immunity approach, and signed the Great Barrington Declaration and decided not to lock down, something that possibly, well, very likely led to tens of thousands of additional deaths. And we see that in the government approach now, where, you know, vaccination for adolescents has been hugely delayed, with the consequence that now 1 in 12 teenagers have infection when they could have been vaccinated over the summer. And I think we've had more than 10 deaths already this month in children, many of which were avoidable.
Can we explain to just the audience sometimes, because I remember I was there 12th of March when herd immunity was first mentioned, particularly on a blog by Robert Peston. He won't tell who briefed us. Dominic Cummings said he went against the herd immunity principle. But that was wasn't that just crazy at the time? Because herd immunity, natural immunity, if you like, without inoculation, is nearly always, in every other bit of literature I'd read, that those days and days afterwards was in conjunction with a vaccination, which you didn't have, and also relied on serology, of understanding how a virus, the antibody reaction, how long natural immunity obtained in the human organism. And we knew none of that back in March, and we still really only have 1.5 years of data about natural immunity, don't we?
And, no country has achieved herd immunity at all, despite, 19 months being over. And the idea that you should protect yourself from an infection by getting infected is frankly absurd. And what I find really amazing is, Dominic Cummings and government officials have said that they found it hard to go against scientific consensus. UK scientific consensus and global scientific consensus was not that we needed to go for herd immunity through infection. There might have been people in SAGE who thought that, but there were scientists who were screaming from the rooftop saying that this is unethical, is going to lead to mass death. I mean, imagine if we said, get infected with Ebola to protect yourself from Ebola, or get infected with measles to protect yourself from measles. I mean, it's as absurd as that, but it was completely normalized by a government that took that exceptional approach. And that's something mentioned in the report, this exceptionalism, and it still lives on. I mean, we are an outlier in all of Europe in having one of the highest infection rates, one of the highest death rates, even now, and having removed restrictions when only less than 2/3 of our population were fully vaccinated. We are still an outlier. All other countries in Europe have some level of mitigations, and they haven't had this massive surge after opening of schools because they vaccinated their adolescents, took measures in schools. So this exceptionalism, this thinking that we can do things differently from others because we know better and somehow won't have adverse outcomes, still continues.
So when you look at, our film crew was in Germany last week. Everybody in shops was wearing masks, even though they have a much lower infection rate than we do. On the underground, quite extraordinary, if people travel on there, it says it's mandatory to wear masks. Half the tube passengers are not wearing masks. What do you see happening this autumn? Without being alarmist, but what do you see as a sort of mid-range prognosis for levels of infection and hospitalization? Because obviously the correlation is still there between infection and hospitalization, even if it is not so high.
So infection rates are rising. They're rising rapidly in adolescents. And what's really worrying over the last week is they've started rising in other age groups, included vaccinated, highly vaccinated age groups, which is sadly a consequence of this. I mean, it's a consequence of a vaccine-only approach because there will be vaccine breakthrough and there will be people who are clinically vulnerable. There are people who are not vaccinated and they will get ill. So we are seeing rising number of hospitalizations for the past few weeks. We're at 800 deaths per week. And even if that continues, people have normalized this. But let's remember, since 19th of July, when we lifted almost all mandates, we've had 10,000 deaths. I think of those as 10,000 preventable deaths because mask mandates and continuation of some level of mitigations and provision of ventilation in workplace and schools would have prevented a lot of that. And we will likely have another 7,000 deaths before Christmas if it just continues at the same rate as now. If it increases, it'll get worse. And in terms of the NHS, we don't see this a lot in the media, but a lot of the NHS is struggling. Doctors are burnt out. A&Es have huge waiting times. People can't get emergency care, and there are 5.7 million people waiting for routine care. And in the middle of this, we have more than 800 people being hospitalized every day. 1 in 10 people in ICUs are currently have COVID, and this is before the winter crisis. So I think we're heading towards a bit of a disaster right now. And it may not be the sort of scale we saw in the first and second wave, but the fact that we've got a devastated NHS combined with this high rate of continuing infection, which we seem to have normalized. 45,000 cases a day. We are going to have a pandemic of long COVID, which we're already seeing. We're seeing 6,000 referrals with long COVID every single month. We have 1 million people living with long COVID and 400,000 who've had this for more than a year. These are people developing chronic disability in the hundreds of thousands. And that's what's going to follow from a strategy of mass infection.
Well, Deepti, thank you for that warning note, and maybe, especially after the report this week, people in government and in public health will start listening and doing something about it. We'll keep track of that and we'll keep talking to you over the winter. Let's hope the worst doesn't happen, but let's hope also more resources are poured towards that overstretched NHS. Thanks for joining us, Deepti.
Thank you.
Right, so the B word, it doesn't stop. And it's mentioned more, the B word for Brexit. We've had turkeys not coming for Christmas. We've had petrol shortages. And now we're joined by Professor Catherine Barnard from Trinity College, Cambridge, who's an expert on EU law to talk about some more Brexit shenanigans. Thanks for joining us, Catherine.
It's a pleasure.
So, let's start. There's so many things to talk about when it comes to EU law and what the government is up to. Let's start at a sort of more localised one, which is something we saw, potential gunboat diplomacy in the summer, which was issues around Jersey and fishing. Now, that was put on hold, and threats from the French to withdraw energy supplies to Jersey over fishing rights. Can you explain to us just what's going on with one of our favourite subjects here in the last year, which is fishing rights?
Yeah, it's complicated. One of the last things that was negotiated in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that was the text that was agreed on Christmas Eve. Do you remember those very painful last few minutes?
Yes.
Now, one of the issues about fish is the fishing waters around Jersey. And what it was agreed was that Jersey could grant licences to those fishing boats that could prove that they had been fishing in those waters for a number of years prior to January 2021. Trouble is, big boats have big equipment and therefore could prove that they've been fishing in those waters. Small boats have small equipment and so could not produce all the documents necessary to prove they've been fishing in the waters. And what we saw in March, very conveniently on the day of the local elections, was that French fishermen were protesting that they weren't being able to have access to those licences, and the UK, as you rightly said, sent gunboats. Now, or a gunboat, and of course the French retaliated by sending one of their own.
Right,
now, all of that
fantastic.
disappeared the day after the local elections, and it has all gone rather quiet. But the fact is that the Jersey government have been issuing these licences, but these small boats haven't been getting them. And so there's quite a lot of crossness on the part of the French. French, remember, are cross about a number of things. They're cross about fishing licences. They are very cross indeed about the AUKUS deal, that's the defence deal between the US, the UK and Australia, which
Of
they
course,
feel,
yes, the
they
submarines,
have been,
yeah.
Exactly, they've been kicked out of.
And also they tend to
Because-
protest quite vociferously, French farmers and French fishermen. They don't let their grievances
absolutely.
lie
They
quietly.
very much make that point.
Yeah. Can I just
and-
explain to our viewers, sorry, just to explain, Catherine, that for some reason we've had a couple of gremlins tonight, and we are hearing you fairly loud and clear, I hope I can, but for some reason not seeing you. So I apologise to our viewers, they can't see you, but obviously if you hear this on our podcast, it'll sound great. So can we move to a slightly more widespread issue, one with huge political ramifications, given it engages the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Good Friday Agreement, which is ratified by various states, including the Irish, British governments and the US government. What happened this week with Lord Frost, who is the chief EU negotiator, saying that they were minded to trigger Article 16 or sort of renege on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which allows free movement of goods with no land border between North and South of Ireland. And then the revelation of Dominic Cummings that it was all a bit of scam anyway to win the 2019 election. Were you shocked? What are the kind of consequences of this kind of statement for international diplomacy and binding treaties?
Yeah, it's not great, is it? So it had long been thought that Boris Johnson was prepared to agree to the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol just so he could say that he had got Brexit done. And indeed, the permanent secretary in DEXU, Philip Rycroft, has long said that the government knew perfectly well what they were signing up to. They knew about the role of the Court of Justice, the ECJ. They knew about the fact that EU provisions on state aid could apply. And those things are very clear on the face of the protocol. A lot of protocols written in very obscure terms, but not that bit.
Just to explain to the audience, when there comes, tell me if I get this wrong, because I could well get it wrong, is that because Northern Ireland is effectively in some kind of customs union, so there's no hard border which would abrogate the Good Friday Agreement between North and South, it comes under jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is kind of the trade and the main arbiter of trade and commerce, nothing to do with the human the Hague and Courts of Human Rights, this is the arbitral body for EU litigations and rules. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And as you rightly say, not to be confused with the International Court of Justice in The Hague or the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg.
Right.
This is the European Court of Justice. It's a proper court, and it sits in Luxembourg. And because Northern Ireland is part of the customs union and part of the single market for goods, because those EU rules apply, therefore the European Court of Justice has the final say. That's the argument that the EU runs. Lord Frost is now saying, well, this is totally unacceptable. We are a sovereign country and we shouldn't be dictated to by an external court. And that's why the European Court of Justice has no say over the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That's the agreement on the future trading relations. But the Northern Ireland Protocol is under the withdrawal agreement. That's the first text, the Article 50 text that was negotiated. Remember, that was the one Boris Johnson said was an oven-ready deal.
Oven-ready deal, best deal ever.
Absolutely, all of that. But we're now being told it wasn't quite as good as they thought.
We're told they're also, Cathy, if I remember the phrase, they were very different. They were kind of rushed into it. It's like, in those circumstances, they had to accept it. Though Dominic Cummings seems to be saying those circumstances were a domestic election.
Yes, I mean, the argument that the Lord Frost runs is, well, look, at the time the Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed, the Tories did not have majority in Parliament. And Boris Johnson was in a minority government, which is one of the reasons why he called the election in December 2019, so that he could get a majority. The trouble about the argument that they were rushed into it and it was a weak agreement and it was a weak government not knowing what it was doing, was that the evidence from people at the time was that they knew perfectly well what they were signing up to. Yeah. And if Boris Johnson really felt that it was a bad agreement, he could have refused to sign it. But yet he went to the country to say, I've got this oven-ready deal, it's a good deal, let's go for it.
So that doesn't bode well for future governments negotiating deals. Wouldn't you agree, Hardeep, that if we are seen to renege on our existing ones, I mean, is this just very short-term playing for the domestic audience on the part of Frost and Johnson? Is it just sort of saving face, trying to whip up kind of, I don't know, British exceptionalism and we stand alone as a... do you think there's any real strategy behind it, or is it kind of a short-term tactics for culture war purposes?
I do think it's problematic because one of the strands of global Britain, which the UK also trumpets, is that we respect the rule of law. And so on the one hand, we're saying we're a good country to invest in because we respect the rules and there's legal certainty. And yet, on the other hand, in respect to the most important agreements that we have signed in recent years, we look like we did not enter it in good faith. You might recall David Frost said on Tuesday when asked that question, did you enter the agreement in good faith? He said, we enter all agreements in good faith. But by Wednesday, after Dominic Cummings' tweet suggesting they hadn't entered in good faith, Lord Frost said it became somewhat more evasive on the point.
It's very worrying, isn't it? If you want to do future trade deals, renegotiate with the EU, do trade deals, some done with the USA, we cannot be relied on for keeping our word.
Well, this is the point that the Irish government is now making very clear. Look, how can the UK be trusted? And indeed, the Irish government has gone on record to say, look, the UK has got a reputation for not complying with the rules that it signed up to.
So, Catherine, because we can't see you, we'd like to get you back and we can talk more in detail about this on another occasion. I'm very sorry, don't know what's happened to our technical thing or maybe with Zoom. But just one final question. If we do activate Article 16 or whatever it is, that basically, how can the EU retaliate against us? So we're already saying problems with the EU drivers not turning up, care workers not turning up, food not being, shortage supplies, our problems exporting, our problems importing. Importing is mainly on deliveries. How worse can it get before Christmas?
There are a number of questions there.
I'm sorry.
Article 16 is the safeguard clause in the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that would allow the government to suspend the whole or part of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And what that would probably mean is no checks at the border.
Right.
Now, that would be good for the unionist community and good for those who are exporting goods from GB to Northern Ireland. It would also worry the Irish very much because it means that they will have to increasingly scrutinise what's coming into Ireland and not into the single market. If the UK does not follow the terms of Article 16 to the letter, then the EU could retaliate, and what that retaliation might mean down the line is something like a process which ends up before arbitration, and ultimately the EU could be imposing sanctions on us, so those would be tariffs, or they may suspend some of the cooperation in respect of energy. That's one of the issues that we're talking about now.
Right. Well, look, again, apologies for the technical difficulties. Maybe we'll get you in a couple of weeks' time where this develops and actually we get to see. But thank you for putting up with those technical difficulties.
Thank you so much for your time.
And speak again. So before we get Otto English on the comfy blue sofa, quick look at how the Germans see us, how they see our media coverage of and why Britain seems to be unable to recognise the B word and what Brexit is doing to us.
Yeah, they wrote to Brexit without thinking about the consequences.
We kind of all saw it coming, and now it's a bit like, we told you so.
How does it feel as someone that lives in Berlin, seeing the reports in the UK that everything is the same with supply chain issues and fuel shortages?
Well, it's just not happening in my life, not anywhere around me. When I go shopping, yeah, all the shelves are full. There is no problem whatsoever. I can always get everything.
I can't understand. In Germany, you can buy everything around the clock. We have enough supply, and every day, 6 days a week. Sometimes we have 2 or 3 lorries a day. Yeah, they wrote to Brexit without thinking about the consequences, and the lorry drivers from Eastern Europe, now they got another jobs, and I don't believe that they will come back to Britain because they're not sure if they can work there.
I mean, our stocks are pretty full, as you can see. We've had maybe a few problems with Corona at the beginning of last year with, like everybody else, like toilet paper or whatnot. But otherwise, since then, we've had full shelves, very, very full shelves. No, absolutely no shortage, no. Then we kind of all saw it coming, that there would be problems after Brexit, and that's what was like discussed a lot, and they kind of decided to go through with it, and now it's a bit like, it's a kind of we told you so vibe. But yeah, no, they're in denial.
We have no problem. We have always products. No empty shelves. We have a lot. No, we have a lot of products here. No problems with empty shelves.
No late deliveries.
No. Maybe one product in a month, but that's all.
My name's Aaron Burnett. I'm a freelance journalist here in Berlin, and can I really say that it's a shit show on TV? It's a bit strange to see it. It's also a bit stranger to see how the press and politicians are reacting to it, simply saying that, oh, this isn't due to Brexit, and everywhere else in Europe has these shortages. There's a petrol station behind me. It's very full. There's no queues. There's clearly no shortages.
You need an explanation for your people why the Brexit was the right decision, and so they are trying to make up those stories to support this narrative.
They want to save the Brexit. That's why they are lying, I think.
There are so many bad things about Brexit, and I can very well imagine that they can just not be honest and straight about it. That's just a fact. And the politicians who have caused the situation, of course, they don't want people to see it that way.
I think Boris Johnson is a big liar.
Britain is a laughingstock for Europe at this point already, I would say.
And we're now joined in the studio by our Byline Times regular writer, Otto English. Otto, thank you for coming back and joining us. Now, obviously, the big news today is the murder of Sir David Amess, the second sitting MP to have been killed in 5 years. Of course, Joe Cox was murdered by a far-right terrorist in 2016. The tributes have poured in, as we've said earlier in the show, from across the political spectrum. And it seems that Sir David's kindness and his gentleness has been commented upon quite a lot. I mean, what's been your reaction to it today, and where this really sits within, the political divisions and our democracy? And, do we take for granted too easily that our representatives do put themselves on the line, in the same way as sort of police officers or doctors and nurses?
Shouldn't be like that, should it? I mean, I probably, like all of us, I was just looking at my Twitter feed, as I do intermittently, and the first story came up that he'd been attacked, and I thought, how horrendous. And obviously I knew who he was, backbench MP. He was on my radar over the last 5-10 years.
And then followed his work.
Well, sort of. I mean, I was aware of who he was. He's a sort of stalwart Conservative backbencher, wasn't he?
So first elected in 1983, I think, for Basildon.
And I think the second longest serving Conservative MP. So I think I heard earlier in the evening that his ambition was to become Father of the House and thus become the longest. But of course, that sadly will never happen. But then, however many hours later, I looked at the news again, and of course, he died. And I have to say, it absolutely got me. I was surprised. I shouldn't say I was surprised. I was really, really taken aback by it, because it is such a horrendous thing. Somebody going about their day, 5 children, 69 years old. He's the stalwart MP. He goes in to have his constituency surgery and probably had done it 1,000 times and doesn't come home, and that's shocking, isn't it? It's shocking. It's not the kind of thing you ever expect to happen in Britain. And obviously the same thing happened, as you say, to Joe Cox 5 years ago.
It's also an attack on our whole democratic system, isn't it, when that happens?
Yeah, but you want politicians to be approachable, and you want them to be what they are, MPs. You don't want them to be sitting in fear for their lives. And I'm sure a lot of MPs tonight across the country they will have worried families. They themselves will be worried for their safety and worried loved ones. And so the whole of our democracy gets shaken by these events, because the whole process of parliamentary democracy kind of gets undermined. That whole level of accessibility starts to go.
And I guess one of the things that's often levelled at MPs, and generalisations are made about them as a class of people, is that, well, they don't know anything about ordinary people's lives. They're sort of in Parliament and they're very disconnected. But as you say, Otto, and Sir David Amess's whole approach appears to have been that he really loved that element of connecting with people and the constituency level work, which, there should be more emphasis placed on that increasingly in our democracy, it seems, rather than less. And yet things like this raise questions.
Well, the media and everything is so divisive, isn't it? And as you were saying earlier, with the whole MP expenses scandal, MPs almost became pariahs to a lot of people. But I grew up in a very political household. My parents were Conservatives. My father was a local Conservative councillor. We knew MPs. My parents were friends with MPs. In fact, my mother had worked for 20 years for Airy Neve, who himself was assassinated whilst going around his daily route in a car bomb in the House of Commons in 1979. Which weirdly, I wonder whether that's what really got me earlier, because it's kind of my first childhood memory was being at a friend's house, and the lunchtime news came on, and there was this Vauxhall car in the gullyway of the House of Commons car park. And it was my mother's friend and former boss, Airy Neve. And I remember it shaking me then, because as a child, you kind of expected there to be certainty, and this is you didn't expect, and you never expect, politicians to be murdered. Yeah.
Obviously, we don't know
the
anything.
details.
We know that a 25-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of murder. We don't know.
Not looking for anybody.
I mean, they're not looking for anybody else. The police have said we don't know anything else about the circumstances or any motives or anything like that, and we will not speculate on that. But also, what's your sense of? Are you worried that there will be an inevitable sort of politicisation, weaponisation of Sir David Ames's
of course there will.
Or?
Of course there will be. So whatever has happened, whoever is responsible, whatever their motive or whatever drove them to do it, and we have to be very careful because, of course, it's an ongoing investigation. There will be an inevitable backlash, and there will be more rage and anger, and the country will tear itself apart, and social media will tear itself apart again. And you know, it's very depressing, isn't it? Because how do we ever get the country to sort of come back to some sort of point of normality again? And every time an event like this happens, your heart, let's say every time, happily it doesn't happen too frequently, but your heart sinks into the ground because you can sort of predict what is going to come over the next few weeks. And you can predict that people will say and do the wrong things deliberately, and whip up crowds and whip up anger, and columnists will start writing things and blah-de, 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 blah. The fact of the matter is, tonight there's a family that's lost its father, and there's a democracy that has lost a politician.
In terms of both of you, what's your sense of how events like this fit in with the wider political divisions and polarisation, I guess, of public discourse that we've seen in Britain and elsewhere in recent years? I mean, you know, there are stabbings of attempted murders and stabbings of parliamentary assistants and attendees before even Joe Cox. I mean, Joe Cox was a kind of watershed. I also think the 2016 mayoral campaign, where effectively the Prime Minister suggested that Sadiq Khan was a terrorist or affiliated with terrorists, was a dangerous precedent. I see the kind of that element tamping down a bit among politicians, and maybe the fact that in a way both Labour and Conservative have lost MPs who were loved across the House, you know, will make them consider the rhetoric they use. I mean, without so cheapening the conversation, but Otto's written a very, was before judging things today, rather amusing piece about Luftwaffe, this word you stolen from another comedian. Yeah. But this language that we're at war with Europe, it's not as bad as the Blitz and all that, you know, we survived the Blitz, you may have to describe a bit more of that. It's all ramped up, and this happens to other debates around identity politics, the existential threat that somebody disagrees with you, or that EU might have a difference of trade rule. It's everything has to be seen in terms of battle, and I think that rhetoric does escalate, and some people, if they're disturbed, you know, if they're very, you know, extreme, people can be driven, as we see, you know, radicalized, you know, through social media, through their sort of fears of society.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, haven't we seen that over the last and it's from before the EU referendum it was going on. I mean, this has been going on for a decade.
Really? You think it's a decade?
I think it's a decade.
Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, you know, certain, I mean, you know, I don't want to invoke the Scottish referendum, but that was pretty nasty. The EU referendum was really nasty. I mean, I remember even just as a campaigner for Remain being on the streets of Lewisham, of all places, you know, Remain Central, and some nasty situations in the street. Now, having never campaigned in any election or referendum before, I don't know if that's normal, but there was a lot of aggression. People are very wound up and have been very wound up all round. And taking away from the David Amos thing, people have been wound up and driven on all sides.
Yeah, and we see it in America, not just in the UK.
And in America. Yeah. And it's important to stress it's on all sides because a lot of people have been driven into little cultish corners of this country and got very, very angry with the rest of them. And I genuinely don't know how we come out of that ever.
What do you think, Ali? Let's reverse the question to you a bit. Is there a way of depolarising things, or is there, and I sense this, is it actually a small, and I felt this after Brexit, by the way, in terms of, you know, and this is personal, people I know having, you know, being racially assaulted or verbally racially assaulted. It's a permission given from top. I'm not saying Brexiteers or Ramonas or whatever, a permission for violent language, which we know leads to violent behaviour.
I think this today, again, as Otto says, everyone is shaken. I feel that too. And I felt that the day that Jo Cox was also murdered during the EU referendum campaign. And she was shot and she was stabbed on the street outside a constituency office. And I always, you know, that often still pops into my head that happened because I find it so shocking that happened during that campaign, which is a very polarised battle, you know, that language. It was all very polarised political campaign. And I just think we moved on so easily from that. And I think what the legacy of Jo Cox has been as an individual has been her belief in we've got more in common than we have that divides us. We're better together.
That's her movement, and they have an event round here.
But unfortunately, what is still lacking, I think, is leadership at the very top, which is emphasising that message that we can be Brexit and Remain, we can get Brexit done, but and I hate, you know, it probably is an obvious thing to say, but if anything, the divisions of all kinds, perhaps not relating to this at all, have been amped up. Then it's not that the message. It's not. It
becomes the process of politics.
This is
culture wars.
Yes, I mean,
which is the most
we have to separate that to some extent from the David Amos thing. But I, as you know, I completely agree with you. The language of this government, the government should be for everybody, you know, regardless of who they won and who voted for them. Government should represent the entire nation. And this, you're either with us or against us, you know, you're against our history and these defines and all of this language. Again, on both sides, but the Conservative government in particular has been very rampant on this stuff.
And they're the ones in the positions of leadership.
And they are the ones in positions of leadership. And I think when I say where is the road forward, I think the road forward is that. Some sort of leader down the line who can genuinely bring the vast majority of people who are normal, sensible people in this country, as they are everywhere, together back into some hole in the middle.
So sadly, we have to finish there. Slightly delayed by some technical glitches and obviously a very sad night, which we want to discuss more and more detail. Find some rays of hope, and you can join us in our After Dark Q&A. Otto will be staying there on the sofa, and so will Hardeep. If you join us about 5 minutes, you have to sign up to our Patreon account, patreon.com/Byline TV, or in YouTube, the membership account. Sorry about that. It's the only way you can keep going and pay our staff and everything like that. But if you possibly can, Do join us after the break. Until next week, goodbye from me.
Yes, and thank you for joining us. Good night.
Bye-bye.